Hey guys, my name is Tudor and today we're gonna talk about some ideas regarding the MVVM architecture, the future, why does it represent an optimization to older architectures, and why is this a step forward from MVC. We're also gonna touch base on why we shouldn't use MVC again, why it's part of the lost world, like those old actors that tried to make it again in the third millennium but simply doesn't work. They were cool 20 years ago and that's perfectly great, but now things have to move forward. We're gonna talk about the complexity, the scalability, and how to optimize it, and of course what impacts does it have on you and on your projects. First of all, why should you use a proper architecture? Might one ask. Why don't you just write code like a caveman? Well, simply because you gotta think it through in order to make a great product and in order to make a great profit. This is not a new idea. We're just trying to figure out new ways how to cope with this idea and how to think about the scalability and proper optimization. Not so long ago we thought as MVC as a pretty awesome architecture, as a pretty awesome design pattern way to think of a project architecture, but we figured out that idea of displacing the view, the controller, and practically the model in three different entities and investing a lot of effort in making each entity perform the best can be reached even further if we would couple more the controller to the view in order to have a better sense of performance. The problem in nowadays is that you have to think that your app has to be very fast responding. You cannot risk it having a very slow controller, and as the controller increases in business logic, it tends to be slower and make further more verifications or something like that. What you want to do is to scale down and to divide the view in different parts and having combined with an layered architecture, having combined with its own components that are responsible for a certain reason. For example, if we talk about a web app, we can think of widget zone to have its own data source, to have its own networking, have its own binding components that related to the data, and getting the data better and faster to the view and much better organized. And this is something new, unfortunately. This idea of having only for 5 or 6 years, they tried to implement that into the controller, and at the time when MVC was developed, several years ago, it was a pretty great idea because they were coupling too much the view to the data, but in the wrong way. So those projects were not flexible at all. Those projects had some very short timeline, and they would produce much more bugs than features being implemented, and that practically meant losing money. And in order to manage some projects of that kind would mean investing a lot of money in it, and that divides from the scope. Preferences in terms of webs and web apps, you have to divide the point of interest. You have to have multiple multiple smaller controllers that bind the view to the data, and each one is responsible for a very small little thing, and you gotta have more of those, very better organized. And they say, hey, John Guzman came up and said, hey, why don't we call it view model, because that's what it does. It binds the view to the model, and this is where the MVVM comes from: model, view, model, view, model architecture. And you can think about, hey, I'm gonna have a very powerful controller and filters the data 100 times, so, and orders the data and applies any maps and many filters on the data. This so that you have 100% correctitude, correct data displayed to the view. If you do something like that, you lose a lot of performance time, and performance time is one of the things that that defines a successful product from a failure one. So having displayed the risk from multiple components, smaller components, and organize them within my preference is a layered architecture, but anybody can organize them with any kind of architecture they want. That is the way to go. And because we are getting to the principle of simply binding the view through the model and having some binding components, we call it view model, that I can have a data source, that can have a network manager, network component, that can have other business logic, smaller components. We are sticking up to the principle of MVVM, and this way it's much faster. The code is much cleaner, I say, it's much better organized, and it's easier to maintain. Now there's another thing that comes into bigger projects. They want to make it big, display cool ideas, and that is the problem of scalability. Now the only thing you gotta be careful is where you organize those components, where to maintain some solid principles, solid programming principles, and other decoupled architecture design patterns. And again, I'm going back to layered architecture design pattern. If you follow these principles, you can create a very organized MVVM model. Now, after business logic, after business logic, after business logic, you will not understand anything. It will be like a communist teacher trying to teach the boring parts of physics to some very open-minded millennials. It will be something like that. The controller will crash. You're comparing a low-cost design car to a Porsche or a Mercedes. You don't do that. You don't do that. You cannot assemble a car having, hey, let me put all this stuff here, let's have all the business logic into the controller, and if the controller gets too heavy, let's move it onto a separate machine through some distributed computing, magic that we do. You're losing very important computational and performance time doing that. It's never a good idea to concentrate huge amounts of code into only one entity. That's never the way to go. That's why MVVM comes better and displays in dividing a certain. If we're talking about web app, it sustains the division in several regions of a simple screen, and then that region having components responsible for several parts. If we're talking a mobile app, especially on iOS, we are talking about each screen or each part of the screen having its own data source, its own network manager component that is responsible for getting the data and displaying it. And while those components are getting the data, you are able to keep up a state. And that is the key word, because if you keep up a state, you can communicate with the user. And nowadays, when millennials don't have patience, just imagine that the median time of a millennial evaluating your app is 7 seconds up until it opens it. If you don't display the data within 7 or 9 or 10 seconds, you lost him. He's gonna close your app, close your website, and never come back again. So it's crucial that even if your data is not fully ready, you will have to display a very cool spinner or very cool message that you engage the user. Engaging the user, it's so much important nowadays that was never been before. And you cannot engage millennial state of mind user thinking with programming principles that were designed ago or 30 years ago. It simply does not make sense. You have to divide and conquer practically, as the Romans invited this principle. You have to divide the problem into different solutions. You have to create multiple, even if it requires using delegates like design patterns like the delegate or multiple design patterns besides the MVVM, and like I said, only MVVM won't do the job. You also have to stick to some solid principles, implementing architectural design pattern like layered. I'm a big fan of layered base, and you gotta do much more than that. Simply MVVM won't solve your complexity and your scalability and especially your performance issues. But if you implement MVVM and take care of several programming principles, that is much easier to go than simply going like with an MVC or overrated design pattern. And after all, we're all thinking of creating the user database. Everybody wants its app, its website to be used as many as possible with as many users as possible. Nobody wants to be set up in the corner, and they are all in the industry to grow. They are all in the industry to grow their user database to get as much market share as possible. Nobody is in here to go lower. Nobody will say, hey, we can work with this and we'll be fine. No one is here for fine. Everybody is entering in the software industry for great, and you cannot achieve great if you don't apply the latest technologies, if you don't apply the latest programming principles. And one important thing is the mindset when you're designing something. In the past, this is especially relevant for the old software engineers in the past who wanted to have their algorithm, very sophisticated algorithms. That's why the idea of a controller came up in the first place for an MVC, because they have very complex algorithms, and you spend tremendous amount of time to those algorithms to be executed and then to validate the data 100 times. It's very important to have a good algorithm, good data processing layer, but it's much more important to parallelize that layer. It's much more important to bring that layer closer to the view, and that is all what MVVM stands in, and that's why it got so much terrain in the last years. And I just wanted to eliminate every confusion, because there are some people out there who don't understand the difference between an MVC architecture and MVVM. And a very interesting joke is that you have an MVC architecture that is perfectly implemented and the project runs fast. If you dig deeper, you'll see that that controller layer is divided through multiple smaller controllers that is binded to a view, if the project is very well implemented. And that's practically the definition of an MVVM. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. Put your comments below. Do you agree or disagree with this? Hit the subscribe button for more videos, and see you later. Write cool code and let it be.